This is my introduction to Sailing Wilson on YouTube. I'm Captain Wannabe Ian. Yes, I do have a sailing certificate. In fact, I have two. Whether I can sail or not is another story. I own a 2013 Island Spirit catamaran, 38 foot in length, and I really love my boat. I'm sure you've heard this before, but please give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel and push on the notification bell. That'd help a lot. By the way, please share my videos with other people you know. I'm currently on the hard stand at Rebec Island Shipyard, which is in the top middle of the photograph. Rebec Island is a resort island just off the main island of Langkawi in Malaysia. Here's a Google Earth image of my boat, just beside the blue dot on the hard stand, and here's a photograph of my boat just after I finished putting the copper coat on. I've still got a lot of work to do. This video is about the top deck hatches, our haul out progress report part 34. Started out by removing all the bolts from around both hatches. The reason we removed the hatches was because the water had started seeping in around the bolts and into the foam core and past the laminate. So the best way to deal with that was to remove the hatches, and you can see in this video how I'm using a chisel to get in between the aluminium frame and the fiberglass top deck, and I took my time because I'd already seen examples of how people had removed these aluminium framed hatches and caused damage to the actual aluminium frame. Here you see I'm using a soft mallet hammer and a Stanley knife to split away the old sealant. So both my wife and myself worked at that using the Stanley knives and finally got it loose, and you can see it came off fairly easily. And then it was a matter of just removing the old sealant and tried different methods. Here's the chisel, but it worked out to be the Stanley knife was the quickest way. And here is a photograph of both hatches ready to be cleaned up. There was a gap between the top deck and the roof of the galley where the foam core was, and that was to provide access for the wiring for the solar panels and other electrical equipment. And we quickly realised that pouring a thickened epoxy in just ran away inside the roof lining, and that meant we had to use a method my father taught me about drilling a bigger hole and then putting some wooden dowel in and then drilling down into that dowel to get some kind of foundation for the new bolts. So here you can see me using a larger drill bit to drill out the holes, and I had to be careful not to push right through the whole frame and get the right depth for not only the screws but the dowel, and I used my finger to get the length right. And I rounded out the holes a little bit more so that we could get the dowel in there. It took me ages to find a hardware that actually sold the hardened version of this 2 meters of dowel that I purchased, and then we cut it to those measured lengths that we needed to then epoxy the dowel and push them into the holes and then tap them down with a hammer, a soft mallet hammer. So we used the Scotch 40mm tape to prepare the areas for the hatches so that we wouldn't make a mess when we used the epoxy, and we went about mixing up batches of Kosan 90, and that's basically 2 parts A and 1 part B, and 2 or 3 parts of the West Systems filler. So I use West Systems filler because I found other products inferior. And as I said, we then poured a certain amount into the hole, and then some onto the short lengths of dowel, and then pushed the dowel into the holes that I'd drilled, and then used a wooden mallet to tap them down and bed them in, and it worked well. Only one was loose when we did use the bolts to screw them in place. And here you can see the finished job the next day once it had hardened, once the epoxy had hardened and ready for sanding. The blue Scotch 40mm tape worked a treat, but we forgot to put plastic around, so made a bit of a mess. Not much. But here I am using an air sander to sand off the excess epoxy and the excess wood, because once we tap them into place, some of the wooden dowel were poking above the surface, so it had to be sanded flat so that we had a reasonably flat surface. And then we removed the tape, and it was ready for drilling out the centre of the dowel. So then I went around and drilled out all 18 holes on each hatch, being careful not to drill right through into the roof of the galley, and unfortunately the drill got a little bit stuck now and then, and it was a bit of an effort to get those holes drilled out. So once I'd finished drilling out these holes to the right depth, the length of the bolts, I laid a bead of white Sikaflex 295 UV around the framework of the upper deck hatch. Then I used a small spatula to spread it evenly, so that when the hatches went on top of it, it would bleed out evenly as well. When you use Sikaflex in areas that are exposed to the sun, you should use the UV product. So then I put the hatch in place, making sure that it didn't squeeze out too much of the Sikaflex, and also to make sure that I've got the right amount of Sikaflex. You notice that I'm having trouble with the bolts that are actually close to the window side of it. The angle was not quite right. It was a bit of an effort to get these bolts screwed in without destroying the Phillips head of the bolt. Just a little bit of advice: it was really hot and it was 35 degrees, and you should really just screw in, say, 4 of these bolts, and then get the pressure down right, and then clean up the Sikaflex before it goes hard and forms a skin and makes it difficult to get a good finish. And that was what we did, and it worked out rather well, and I didn't have any problems with it at all. Once I finished that, I went for lunch and gave the Sikaflex time to dry before I proceeded with cleaning up. And my wife provided me with this absolutely wonderful, yummy soup. While I was having lunch, we were entertained by the monkeys ripping apart a coconut while it was still on the tree and digging in and drinking the contents and also eating the flesh of the coconut. Then after lunch I went out onto the deck and pulled away all the blue tape, cleaned up the mess that I'd made and just made it look rather nice. And you'll see a couple of areas where some of the deck still needs to be painted, but it really did turn out well, both the upper deck and the hatches. I'm happy. The video was produced by myself, and that's the end of part 34 of our haul out progress report so far, and that's fixing up the top deck hatches.